I had sailed upriver from Manaus in the late 1880s with a small party of Victorian naturalists and a steam launch, charged to collect specimens for the Royal Society. We expected orchids and monkeys, not a rumour older than our charts. The night we lost the last flicker of our kerosene lamps and the river answered us with a sound like tearing timber, unease became a certainty. We were a mixed crew of 2 Victorian naturalists, a photographer with a wet plate collodion camera, 3 indigenous guides, and a river hand, provisioned with a sextant, chronometer, specimen jars of alcohol, and canvas botanical presses as we steamed into the upper Rio Negro. I kept that inventory and a running account of our purpose on the first page of my field journal, dated March 12, 1888, to catalogue unknown mammalia and, if possible, to disprove local fable for a forthcoming paper to the Society. Our map was inked with latitude and longitude. I marked each bearing with the care of a man who trusted numbers where others might trust tale. The launch, a modest iron-hulled affair, made a cough of black smoke against the low, mangled light. Our river hand, João, tended the boiler with a practiced economy of motion, passing me a coal-shoveled glove as if one gesture might keep the whole enterprise in order. My colleague, Dr. Arthur Blythe, read the chronometer at noon and took sextant sights, while the photographer, Mr. Corbett, prepared his plates in the portable dark tent lashed to the deck. The collodion had a chemical smell, ether and nitrate, sticky on the fingers and clinging to the air like a warning. Corbett worked with the rapidity of long practice. Each glass plate was coated, exposed, and fixed before the light could change its mind. At every landing, we exchanged coins and sugar, and, more importantly, conversation. Our 3 guides spoke of rivers within rivers, of flooded forests where trunks stood like cathedral pillars, and of a creature the caboclos called by a name I never mastered without apology. They did not scoff when we spoke of mammalia. They looked instead like men describing a neighbour, known, inconvenient, to be treated with respect. We loaded specimens into jars of spirits, beetles pinned inside paper, a small opossum wrapped in oilcloth, pressed orchids breathing between the canvases. The botanical presses took the humidity in measures I could see, leaves turning dark, mildew crawling at the edges if we did not change the blotters each dawn. Our routines became a liturgy: exposure, fix, label compass, latitude, note. The Rio Negro itself imposed its character. The water was the color of old ink. It smelled of wet wood and tannin and the slow rot of leaves. Rain came like a rehearsal, short, sudden, demanding the fastening of tents and the cursing of collars. But the nights were the worst, when the humidity pooled and the mosquitoes made a high, unrelenting drum. At those hours, the wood of the launch creaked as if in conversation with the forest. I would sit rubbing the condensation from my spectacles while João mended a rope and Dr. Blythe catalogued the teeth of a specimen by lamplight. Corbett, when the wet plate allowed, coaxed silhouettes from the gloom. An ibis, a peccary, his dark-room lantern a small constancy against the black of the river. Navigation required constant correction. The Rio Negros channels shift with the rains. Our chart showed a dozen islands that did not appear and suggested banks where only water lapped. I measured our longitude with the chronometer against our sextant sights and wrote the numbers neatly, though each set of coordinates felt provisional, like a statement I could not be wholly sure of. The men laughed quietly when I insisted on repeating the observation, but they knew the value of stubbornness when it came to keeping a course. And yet, Among this practical work and the slow accretion of specimens, the guide's stories threaded through our days like an undertow. They spoke not of beasts to be shot and mounted, but of something larger, lumbering where the flooded forest kept its own counsel. We noted those words with the polite skepticism of scientists, but I placed them in the margin beside the map. I found a peculiar solace in having a place to store them. On the night when our lamps guttered, the men had gone to sleep with boots off and tools in hand. Corbett had left his plates to dry. Blythe had his journal open, a pencil paused above the paper. I remember the small domestic sounds, the scrape of a canvas, the tinkle of a jar in its crate, before the river answered. We exchanged a look that had the weight of the chronometer hands. We were, by then, too far upriver to turn back without ceremony, and the current was already urging us toward whatever waited in the black water and the swollen forest. We assembled the field party on the bank of the tributary with the urgency of men about to cross an ocean of green. It was the autumn of 1879. My chronometer agreed with the river's languor. The latitude in my journal read 3 degrees 12 S, though we were seldom afforded exactness beneath that canopy. Our company comprised 2 fellow naturalists, Dr. Anton Muir, who kept the botanical presses, the ship's photographer, Elias Finch, who managed a collapsible wet plate camera, and Collodion, a naval surgeon from the river steamer, and 3 caboclo guides hired at Barcelos. Each man carried his tools: a brass compass, a chronometer, knives and machetes, a Colt Navy revolver at the surgeon's hip, specimen jars and spirits of wine, and a box of plaster of Paris for casting any prints. The Amazon made itself known in particulars: days of oppressive humidity that steamed the brass of instruments, sudden torrential downpours which warped Finch's wet plate negatives until entire morning's exposures clouded, and nights dense with an insect chorus that could drown conversation. The guides spoke in low tones of an animal their elders named O Grande Preguiça, the great sloth, a name uttered with the deference one reserves for a storm. We found the riverside quiet, where capybara once fed at dusk. An unfamiliar cracking in the canopy left the men uneasy, and our compasses seemingly sluggish beneath the heavy foliage. I recorded the barometer and noted a perturbation of spirit levels on the tripod. Finch's compass trembled and then rested a few degrees off our true bearing, a small thing until it compounded with the river's braid and our exhaustion. We marked trees with blazes and measured girth. Several saplings were snapped cleanly 2 fathoms above my head, a perpendicular shearing no peccary or jaguar could make. The bark bore parallel abrasions as though from a hand the size of a man's torso, and the leaves beneath were stripped in a crescent matching one great slow sweep. We set a watch and took turns at the camera. Finch swore by his collodion, yet his plates would fog and collapse, not solely from rain, but from an air that seemed soaked with a fine, oily mist which smudged both glass and memory. At dusk, we laid a plaster cast where a footprint had sunk into the river mud. The cast took like quick clay and revealed an excavation the size of 2 men's boots placed heel to heel, with long, curved impressions at the fore. We photographed the impression, measured its depth with calipers, and set a pin to return at first light with garlic and tobacco smoke. The guides advised for warding. Food dwindled with the days. Salted meat and biscuit grew stale beneath the humidity, and morale frayed into practical watchfulness. Small human gestures steadied us. Muir cleaning his plant presses by lamplight, the surgeon humming a psalm while retying a blistered bootlace, the guides exchanging compact, emphatic phrases in Portuguese and Nhingatu. Once, when the cracking answered by a series of low groans, all motion halted, even the insects abated as if listening. We conferred over the chart, debated whether to push upriver toward a tributary, the guides named Igarape do Pau Grande, or to hold and gather more evidence. That night, I slept with my journal beneath my head and the plaster cast within the tent, awake enough to hear the canopy sigh and the river rustle like cloth. The compasses continued to hedge their answers, the negatives stained by a mist I could not bottle, and the guides' faces were set to a determination I recognized. Preparation against something old and large enough to bend the very map. We advanced at dawn, hearts arranged to duty rather than fancy, intent on following the spoor that led deeper into a green-grown strange. And the next day, when the trail widened and the broken canopy opened to reveal a clearing stripped of young trees, the air itself seemed to hold breath. On a morning of low river and red clay, we discovered enormous three-toed impressions along the bank and parallel gouges on a Brazil nut and chiba, deep enough to strip bark and force lianas aside. A line of crushed undergrowth suggested something had moved, with deliberate weight. The first of us to speak was João, our steersman, who ran a hand along the nearest print and spat the brown river water from his mouth as one might test the weather. Mr. Caldwell, who carried the glass plates and the field camera, stood with his hands to his face, as if to steady a lens he could not yet focus. I remember the small domestic outrage of the thing. His tripod had been toppled, and one of the plates lay smeared upon the soil, the emulsion streaked with the broad, wet pattern of a palm far larger than any man ought to possess. A jar of preserved beetles, our specimen for the entomological cabinet, loosened of its cork, and the insects scattered like black confetti, lay among crushed leaves. We made quick the manner of men practiced in expedients. Dr. Henrique Duarte fastened the quadrant to his belt and took the bearings he had sailed up the Rio Negro in 1874 and knew its moods, and his hand betrayed no tremor as he adjusted the sextant against the dim gleam of the overcast. I took inventory aloud. Camera, 3 glass plates, maps, chronometer sealed in oilcloth, 2 spare muskets and ammunition, a bolt of canvas for shelter, sugar, coffee, salted pork, the medicament chest. Caldwell wiped the emulsion from his ruined plate with a sleeve and declared with an English impatience that we must make another exposure at once, while the light held the silvered quality that flatters detail. João unshouldered a machete and tightened the lanyard that bore his powder horn and flint. We called for our guides, 2 Ribeirinho brothers, Manuel and Sebastião, whose knowledge of the quartzo and clay was the only chart that matched this inland geography. We moved with ceremony, for there is a discipline to such observations that is as much moral as practical. We measured the length and the spread of the toes with a brass tape. Duarte recorded the depth in his leather-bound notebook and sketched the striation of the claws. The gouges upon the Brazil nut were regular, almost architectural. 2 parallel furrows, standing at chest height for a man of ordinary stature and deeper than a great boar's tusk would cut. Where the ceba's bark lay shredded, the air smelled of the sap, sweet and coppery, and the sap had stained the clay like a small wound. We photographed them with deliberate exposures. Caldwell propped the camera once more, and, hands made steady by custom, made a plate whose glass I feared would also be sullied by some broad touch. he did not laugh. The ordinary noises of the forest, chitter of monkeys, the insect chorus, the river's slow complaint along its bed, seemed for a moment to be held at bay. I suggested we follow the trail a short distance inland to discover if it widened or betrayed a lair. Manuel shook his head, the way a man who has seen too much knows how to refuse what his stomach tells him to avoid. But the curiosity of science demanded a deputation. We left our camp, the hammocks swaying like slept in corpses, and took, in addition to our usual arms, a coil of rope, a lantern filled with kerosene, and Caldwell's spare plates wrapped in oilcloth. The march through the crushed undergrowth was slow. Each step released the smell of fermenting leaves and the river moss. Lianas that had been forced aside groaned back the clay sucked at our boots. After 100 yards, the prints altered, spacing irregular, as if the animal had shifted its gait to traverse softer soil. And beside them lay a flattened patch of grass where something large had rested. It was here that we found the broken twig, cleft cleanly in two, and the deeper gouge into the earth as if from a shoulder or flank. Sebastian set his ear to the ground, the sort of old habit that reads a landscape like a page. He rose pale and silent. We heard then, from some distance upriver, the cracking of a bowl like the report of a distant gun, and a low, prolonged sound that had not been made by any beast I could name. No pig, no tapir, no jaguar. It was a sound that moved along the line of trees and then ceased, as though a great weight had been laid down. The light drew thin cloud drifted low over the forest, and the sense of enclosure tightened. My hand found the strap of my pistol without thought. Caldwell loaded another plate, his fingers sure, his face set. Duarte spoke quietly of prudence and of returning to fetch more men, for the specimen implied by these marks was not one to be taken lightly. Yet the tracks ran inland, and with each yard we had committed ourselves. We set our shoulders to the thickening path and advanced, the river's murmur receding, the forest swallowing the daylight ahead. The day closed around us like a lid. We carried our lanterns for more than illumination, to mark, perhaps, that we intended to see the thing we had already marked upon the earth. The ground before us bore fresh disturbance, and as we moved, a final sound, close and deliberate, fell. An enormous rustle of leaves, then silence, and whatever we sought had become aware that we were following. Late one night, by the guttering light of our kerosene lamps, and under a moon thinned to the size of a coin, I watched a hulking silhouette rear against the canopy. It loomed like some prostrate ruin of the primeval wood, its forelimbs raking the bole of a ceiba until the bark split in parallel furrows. The river itself seemed to hush when it moved. The usual chorus of frogs fell away, fish made no plash, and even the night birds ceased their thin cries. Its breathing was slow and deliberate, a measured exhalation that felt less like the respiration of an animal than the respiration of the forest itself. We had formed a small field party. Myself, my assistant R. Hargreaves, 2 Brazilian guides, and 4 of the crew, armed with the single snares and traps we had brought, 2 breech-loading rifles, a compass, spare cartridges stored in oilcloth, and the short machetes that had already kept us from starvation and fever. We kept kerosene lamps suspended from saplings and set a magnesium flare ready in a gunny bag. The men were bareheaded from the heat, their shirts sweat-sewn to their spines, and their faces showed the strain of 2 months within the green dark. When the giant sloth shifted its weight, the earth seemed to give. Hargreaves and I exchanged a look, the kind practiced by a pair who had once been cadets on a survey ship and now found themselves legislating life and death. We fired 2 warning shots from our breech-loading rifles into the hollow air above it, a noise I had imagined would be answered by a scatter of monkeys or an alarm of parrots. Instead, we set alight the flare. The flash threw the animal into a silhouette of bone and muscle. It answered with a sound like a great branch breaking, an exhalation that carried a timbered collapse. And for 1 tense minute, there was no more movement than a sleep thawing in stone. The men gripped their rifles as if by will alone could they transmute lead to courage. At last, it retreated into the dark. Only the torn leaves and the teeth of the undergrowth proved it had been. We moved close with lamps low, careful of the riverbank where mud would swallow a man. There were fresh marks in the sabre so high a man could scarce have reached them, and the score of grooves ran one over the other as though some massive hand had explored the tree. Hargreaves measured with a strip of paper. The deepest furrow was nearly an inch across, and the arc of the strokes suggested a forelimb of great length. At the base of the trunk, the earth was churned, and we found broad, half-melted impressions that might have been feet. Our Brazilian guides muttered in low Portuguese, words I could only catch as warnings to leave well enough alone. Their faces had gone pale beneath the dirt. We took what precautions a Victorian naturalist might. A scrap of hair clinging to a lichen, a smear of sap on a torn leaf, the impression of a nail in the bark. The hair was coarse and dark, not the fine hair of the small tree sloth we had seen by daylight, but none among us claimed to know its taxonomical bearing. I wrapped that fragment in oilcloth and wrote careful notes by lamplight. Date, place, bearing from camp, dimensions of the marks. Hargreaves made a quick sketch with the stub of his pencil, more to satisfy his own nerves than any hope of classification. The men argued softly whether to follow at once. Our ammunition was not limitless. Our rifles had been converted, and we had learned to husband cartridges. The guides advised retreat until dawn. I remember the small human gestures, one sailor checking the flint in his rifle, another flexing his cramped fingers where the machete handle had worn a blister. Our youngest crewman, only 19, kept staring at the undergrowth as if expecting the beast to step from it and demand its passage. We did not pursue that night. Instead, we posted 2 sentries and agreed a signal, a single flash of the flare, if the creature approached, and the party slept in shifts. Everyone jolted awake at each distant thrush call. I walked briefly to the river's edge and listened. The hush remained, as though the whole bank held its breath in anticipation. Far upriver, a single tree fell with a long, resounding crack. Someone whispered that it might be the giant sloth again, moving unseen through the blind of the floodplain. We rose before dawn. I could not pretend I sought glory. My wish was to account for what we had witnessed, and to secure whatever evidence we could give to the Royal Society and the museums in London. Yet there was, beneath that resolve, a heavier impression, that we had encountered something the maps did not foresee. We pushed off in our canoe, with the oars making small, deliberate strokes. The men spoke in undertones, and the guides consulted the stars and the compass. The river lay like a band of pewter. I cannot say whether we followed the passage of that great animal, or whether it followed us through the tangle of dawn. But as we slipped into the green, I felt, with a certainty as plain as the compass in my hand, that we were at the edge of an account whose full meaning we had not yet the instruments, and perhaps not the courage, to meet. We abandoned the steam launch at the next trading post, carrying with us a battered field journal, a single damaged wet plate, negative that showed only the suggestion of great curvature and shaggy hide, and the memory of men who could not forget the weight of the forest that night. I resolved then to go back, for the conviction of a man who has seen and not yet understood is a curious and unquiet thing. Back in London, I drew together those I trusted. Thomas Hargreaves, a young zoologist from the Royal College who would not be dissuaded by polite disbelief. João da Silva, a riverman and hunter whose knowledge of the Madeira's banks had steadied our first flight, and a lanky draftsman, Arthur Penn, who moved like a man who had learned to see in detail. We set our dates, June of 1874, took subscriptions, a sextant and pocket chronometer, a barometer, an aneroid and surveying chain, 24 glass plates and the chemicals for the wet collodion process, knives, hatchets, a leaded compass, canvas tents, ropes, iron pins, specimen jars and bladder flasks for spirits. For arms, we carried a double-barreled fowling piece and a revolver. I instructed that these be for show and deterring only. We sailed again for the Amazon, taking the Madeira as our guide, and when the tropic rain put out the sun, we would lower the awning and listen to the river's breath. João read the banks. He followed the gouged Brazil nut trees with a practiced eye. The marks were fresh where the bark lay shorn in broad, deliberate strokes, the reach of a limb far larger than any jaguar might exact. The villagers still spoke the same name in low voices, their word for great and ancient loungers of the wild, and they would not meet our eyes when they said it. Such local nomenclature I noted with care. One cannot wholly discard the language of those who live beside a thing. We moved on foot where the launch could no longer pass, dragging the camera and our instruments on improvised sledges. The forest compressed sight to a narrow, green-streaked corridor. Heat and leech and an unending chorus of insects altered the notion of time. At dusk, we made camp in a clearing among Brazil nuts, the trunks standing like columns with their gouged faces turned to the river. We laid the wet plates under blanket cover and mixed collodion by the light of an oil lamp, fingers blackened with nitrate. Arthur sketched, while Thomas read aloud from Humboldt to keep the night from growing too tall. João kept the watch and, in a voice without flourish, told us where the trees had been stripped as if by a hand. The encounter came upon us, not as an assault, but as a deliberate, immense curiosity. A sound, first like the slow tearing of wood, then a deeper shifting, moved through the air. The fabric of our canvas tent shuddered, the lamp guttered. Arthur rose too quickly, and the fowling piece went from its rack in a human clatter. In the weak light, we saw a mass, towering and broad, a curvature of spine that matched the suggestion on the ruined negative. Long hair hung in damp ropes. It smelled of moss and old wet earth. It reached, and the Brazil nut trunk splintered where it had stood. We did not stand. We acted with the small, practiced motions of men who know retreat when it brings life. João shouted, and in his shout there was no madness but a decision. We ran toward the river, strings of canvas and glass plates rattling. Thomas stumbled and left a camera behind to be abandoned. Behind us, something large moved with a patient strength that did not hurry to pursue. A single report of the fowling piece, meant only to alarm, scribbled across the night. Whether it deterred or merely annoyed, I cannot say. We reached the launch at first light. An overturned canoe, a broken oar, prints in the mud like uprooted trees. One man did not come with us. João's absence fell upon us as a cold fact. We searched to little end. The forest keeps what it will and yields little by negotiation. We pushed downriver with the dawn and found at the trading post the sympathy of those who have known loss and the grammar of practical questions. Back in England, our account met polite skepticism and a short note in a learned journal where a clerkly voice proposed misidentification and illustrated nothing of smell or weight. Yet the local names, the gouged Brazil nut trees, and that one negative remained in the archives, proof enough for some, an unanswered wound in natural history for others, and a question that the river kept. I have kept the journal. When the lamp goes low, I turn its pages and read João's sharp entries, Thomas' sober calculations of reach and stride, Arthur's trembling sketches of curvature. Sometimes at night in London, I awake with the river in my ears, and the notion that some great thing still lurks where the nut trees stand, patient as a fossil, secret as a prayer. The world called for evidence and gave us remarks and footnotes. The forest gave us a man fewer and a set of marks that do not fit comfortably into any catalogue. The river still keeps its question, and we, who remember the weight of that night, carry it like a bruise.